Recently, I made a video about the Sony ZV-1F vlogging camera, specifically stating 10 reasons why I think it's a great vlogging camera. But some of you were quick to note that other reviewers of this camera drew different conclusions, and there were 3 areas in particular where this camera seems to suffer when testing it against other cameras, such as autofocus, stabilization, and the built-in microphone sound quality. So was I evaluating this camera with rose-colored glasses, or is this actually a great camera? Let's talk about that. Also, this video is not sponsored by Sony. They didn't pay me anything, they didn't give me anything. I don't even get to keep this camera, I just have it on loan to test it out, then I have to give it back. So I was not incentivized to say anything positive about this camera. What I did do is just take it out in the field and test it out in the real world, which is what I do with every other piece of gear that I review on this channel. So that's what my observations are based on. So I tested this camera out for several weeks, mostly in vlogging situations, because this is what this camera is for. It's a $500 beginner-oriented camera and really focused on vloggers. Now, of course, vlog styles are all over the place at this point, but when I think of a vlog, especially for Gen Z, which is who this camera is really targeted at, I'm thinking of a vlog like this, where it's mostly a person's face that is being shot, and occasionally turning it around to feature some products and some daily life. Speaking of daily life, what's going on, baby?
DJ.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What you got there? A pen?
Da.
This is not meant to be an upgrade to the ZV-1 or the ZV-E10. If you already own those cameras or if you have budget for them, then they're certainly going to perform better than this camera. This is just an addition to the Sony ZV line of vlog cameras, and it's the entry-level camera. I'm also going to be shooting this entire video on the Sony ZV-1F so you guys can see how the autofocus, stabilization, and other aspects of this camera perform. So let's test out the product showcase function. This is an accessory for the Insta360 X3, which is also a camera that I'm testing at the moment, but you need this little accessory in order to, and the mic adapter actually, to add an external microphone to the Insta360 X3. So first of all, let's talk about autofocus. In my video, I said that the autofocus was really awesome and spot on, and that was true based on the way that I was testing this camera. All of the tests that I did, or a majority of the tests that I did, were vlogging just like this, with myself in front of the camera, and when that's the case, the autofocus actually works really well in terms of identifying a face and the eyes. But the more I test out this camera, the more I am seeing that if there's more than one subject in front of the camera, that the camera does struggle a little bit to figure out which one to focus on. And that's because this camera does not have the top of the line autofocus compared to the ZV-1 or the ZV-E10. Those have better autofocus, but again, you're paying more money for cameras like that. The autofocus in this camera is contrast detection autofocus. The contrast detection autofocus is a little bit slower, but it's more accurate by definition. And in practice, I find that that's very true as well. So if you expect the autofocus to respond really quickly, that's not what this camera is going to do. There's no setting to even adjust the sensitivity of the autofocus in the camera. So it really depends on what exactly you're trying to shoot. But again, from a basic vlogging perspective, I think that the camera focuses really well. Now let's talk about the onboard microphone. Is it good enough, or do you really have to apply an external microphone? Well, I haven't heard too many people critiquing the microphone quality, but I personally think that on Sony mirrorless cameras, or these compact cameras, that the onboard microphones are actually really good. This is one of few vlogging cameras where I would not necessarily recommend adding your own external microphone, although you can certainly do that on this camera. I would honestly just use that onboard microphone, which is what I'm using now and will be using for the rest of this video. Perhaps the main criticism of this built-in microphone is that it has a forward-facing bias, or it's going to sound the best if you're standing in front of the camera, which again really points to how much of a vlogging focus this camera has. But but if I turn the camera around to be facing it, this is what it sounds like. And in my past experience, this should sound a lot better than that previous clip. And actually, on that note of this camera being made for vloggers, that's another reason why I think that 1/4-inch tripod mount is on the bottom corner of the camera. So they actually moved it on the ZV-1. Apparently it was in the middle of the camera on the bottom, but it actually got in the way of the battery door, so people had a hard time changing their batteries and memory cards out. So now Sony moved that 1/4-inch tripod mount to the bottom corner, which some people are saying, like, why is it off center like that? Well, the main reason is because Sony's expecting people to use this camera as a vlogging camera with the flip screen out. And when that's the case, then your tripod is actually right in the center of the camera, so it feels more balanced. Next, let's talk about stabilization. So this camera does not have IBIS or in-body stabilization, which is arguably one of the best forms of camera stabilization, but it does have electronic stabilization. Now the thing with electronic stabilization, and actually most forms of camera stabilization, is that it does crop into your image a little bit. As an example, this is without stabilization, and this is the same shot with stabilization applied. So your effective shooting focal length is no longer 20 millimeters, it's actually more like 24 millimeters. So I'll talk a little bit more about the focal length later, but to focus on stabilization, you know, this is not the best stabilization in all the cameras. The ZV-1 and the ZV-E10 do have better stabilization, but again, they are much more expensive cameras. Now, still with electronic stabilization on, if I start to walk really vigorously, like I'm pumping one arm or break into a run, then sure, the stabilization is not going to be very good, but as long as I slow down and really control myself as I'm holding the camera and control my movements, then I personally think that the stabilization is pretty good, especially for $500. I don't know if it's common where you guys live, but obviously we have a pretty large Indian community here because we are celebrating Diwali apparently. So since I mentioned focal length, let's talk about that for a little bit. Some people are saying that the 20mm focal length on the ZV-1F is not wide enough for vlogging. And I kind of agree and also disagree. I of course would love to have a wider angle lens, especially when you take into account that the 20mm gets cropped in a little bit whenever you apply that electronic stabilization. However, if you do have a focal length that's wider than 20mm, that's when you really start to see some barrel distortion, and people are going to complain that the image now looks kind of warped or fisheye, like a GoPro. So I actually have a 20mm f1.8 lens that I shoot with on my Sony a7 IV, and I primarily do real estate and restaurant interior photos with it. And I find that 20mm is a really nice sweet spot where it feels wide enough to capture most of my environment while still keeping my lines straight. So in that sense, I understand why Sony went for the 20mm focal length, especially considering that that lens is like a pancake lens on this camera, so it helps keep it really compact. So I like that focal length for vlogging. You know, I'm vlogging on it right now, again with that electronic image stabilization crop applied, and I've got the camera about an arm's length away, and I think that this looks pretty good. So in conclusion, was I being unrealistically positive about this camera in my first video? In some ways, perhaps. I do think I probably could have explained a little bit more about who this camera was for and the fact that it's not a replacement for the ZV-1 and the ZV-E10. This is really a beginner-focused camera, and especially for vlogging. So with all that in mind, and after reviewing all of this sample footage, which again was shot with the ZV-1F, let me know what you guys think. Was it fair to critique the stabilization and say that it's actually really terrible? And same with the autofocus and the onboard sound. And is the focal length really too narrow and not wide enough? Let me know what you guys think. But I personally think that, you know, the autofocus could definitely be better because it is kind of biased towards only working in this particular situation when there's a clear subject, single subject in front of the camera. So I would like to see it being a little bit more responsive in other situations. But again, for this main purpose of single person vlogging, I do think it works just fine. Same with the stabilization and the onboard mic quality and the focal length. Like, I still stand by what I said. This is a really good vlogging camera for a very specific kind of user.